You never forget the moment your world ends. Mine came on a Wednesday morning in April, when my father summoned me into his office, the same walnut-paneled sanctuary where I'd spent 23 years earning my place as his successor. I walked in expecting a briefing on the quarterly report. What I got was a burial. "I'm cutting you out of the trust, David," he said, not even looking up from the document he was signing. I blinked, unsure I'd heard him right. "What?" He capped his pen, folded his hands. "You'll receive a modest severance when you leave the company, but you'll no longer have an ownership stake in Sterling Global. It's already filed, legally binding." He said it like he was informing me of a schedule change, like my life hadn't just been ripped in half. "You're disinheriting me?" I asked, my voice embarrassingly small in that big room. "Why?" "There's no place for ego in leadership, David," he replied. "You've become more of a liability than an asset. I need someone hungry, someone who knows how to pivot." I almost laughed. Pivot? I'd saved his empire from collapse in 2017, streamlined the debt portfolio during COVID, renegotiated his mess of a Mideast real estate deal. I had a master's from Wharton, 2 decades of loyalty, and my last name was etched into the building. But none of that mattered. Not anymore. Then I saw him, sitting silently in the corner, dressed too casually for a boardroom. Noah, my cousin, 5 years younger. Tech startup kid. Quiet, always hovering around the edges. The kid my father used to say wasn't built for legacy. Now he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Wait," I said, realization hitting me like a sucker punch. "You're giving him my seat?" Noah looked up, almost apologetically. My father's silence was confirmation enough. I laughed, bitter and hollow. "He's been here, what, for months? He doesn't even understand the portfolio." "He doesn't have to," my father said calmly. "He has vision. He sees the future." "Vision doesn't run a global equity firm," I snapped. "Numbers do. Structures. Strategy. Which is exactly why we're here," my father said. "You're clinging to a model that's dying. Noah's building one that will last." I stared at him, my father, the man I had worshipped. I'd spent my life earning his approval, thinking one day he'd look at me and see an equal. Instead, he saw an obstacle. I left without another word. Didn't argue, didn't beg. What would be the point? The decision was done. I was no longer his son in business, only in blood. And even that felt diluted. Outside the boardroom, I passed Shannon, my executive assistant for 12 years. She looked at me with watery eyes, already aware. "You okay?" she whispered. "I will be," I said. "Eventually." I made it to my office. Shut the door. Sat in the chair I'd bought with my own money back when I got promoted to COO. Leaned back and stared at the skyline. The phone buzzed. A message from my father's legal chief. "Security will escort you out at 3 p.m. That was it. A lifetime reduced to a slot on a termination calendar. I thought about calling my wife, Lisa, but I couldn't. Not yet. Lisa had warned me for years, told me my father only respected conquest, not competence. That I'd been blind. I didn't want to hear, "I told you so," even from someone I loved. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I opened my personal laptop. Backed up files no one would miss. Memos I'd written, presentations I'd built, strategy decks. Nothing illegal. Just reminders of what I'd done. Proof, in case I ever doubted myself. Then I packed one box, shook Shannon's hand, and left through the executive elevator. Nobody clapped. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody even made eye contact. At 3 p.m., I was disinherited. At 3:01, I started planning what came next. I didn't say much for the first 2 days. Not to Lisa, not to anyone. I woke up, put on a collared shirt like muscle memory, made black coffee, stared out the kitchen window while the cup cooled in my hands. She hovered near the counter like she wanted to ask something, but she must have read the weight on my face and let it go. I wasn't ready to talk, because I hadn't stopped bleeding yet, and you don't speak until the wound clots. You don't speak until the fire inside you stops burning in circles and starts burning in a line. By the 3rd day, I was at my desk in the home office, blinds drawn, lights off, 2 monitors up. Not rage, not sadness, something colder, something slower. I began pulling documents, not the confidential kind, not anything that could be twisted into corporate theft, but the publicly available filings, the overlooked board notes, the financials buried behind polished investor reports. I had built Sterling Global from the inside. I didn't need a password to trace the rot. I knew where it would be hiding. And sure enough, It didn't take long to find. There was a press release my father's office had pushed 2 weeks before he cut me out. It had slipped under my radar at the time, masked in vague optimism. Sterling to explore strategic digital partnerships. That's how they worded it. But buried inside the release was a single acquisition, Obelisk Core Technologies, a barely registered crypto consultancy out of Estonia, operating under 5 shell entities, none of which had any verifiable market activity. It wasn't a partnership. It was a cover. I leaned back and stared at the screen. Noah's background came rushing forward in my mind. The failed blockchain project 3 years ago. The heavily marketed, ultimately bankrupt fintech app he tried to pitch at Thanksgiving. The way my father had always brushed it off as youthful ambition. But this time, Noah had threaded himself into something real. This time, he'd found a way to convince my father that Sterling's future wasn't in the slow, careful management of capital, it was in disruption. It was in noise. That night, I said nothing at dinner. Lisa pushed her food around and gave me the space I didn't deserve. I think she knew I wasn't ready to speak until I knew I had something to say that wasn't soaked in defeat. I stayed up after she went to bed, sitting in the dark with the glow of spreadsheets on my face, eyes burning. Around midnight, I opened the folder I hadn't touched in almost a year, my private planning archive, the one I used to sketch out succession scenarios. Inside were files with my initials and Noah's. I'd built projections for both of us. At the time, I did it out of responsibility, out of duty. Now I saw it with fresh eyes. My plan was surgical, long-term, practical. His was built on velocity and public image. And I realized something I should have seen earlier. My father hadn't chosen the stronger successor. He'd chosen the story he wanted to tell investors. I was never disinherited for being weak. I was disinherited for being invisible. The next day, I called Shannon. Her voice broke when she heard mine, like she hadn't been sure I'd ever call her again. I thought maybe you'd left the country, she said, a poor attempt at humor that sat heavy between us. I need a favor, I said. A discreet one. Say it. Do you still have access to the IR group's internal documents? There was silence on the line. Then, a careful reply. I didn't lose my clearance, if that's what you're asking. I need you to search for anything tied to Sterling Horizon. That phrase. Exact. Why? Because that's the name Noah used in an LLC registration 4 weeks ago. I found it on a Baltic registry database. He's already moving assets. I want to know if he's moving ideas. She didn't ask anything else. She just said she'd call me back. The wait felt longer than it was. When she finally rang, her voice had changed. There's a memo, she said. Created 5 weeks ago. Internal only. Marked as a draft, but tagged to your father's personal review group. It's not signed, but the language is pure Noah. It's about restructuring the firm around a decentralized asset strategy. Mentions a shift in leadership. Mentions you directly. What does it say? There was a pause before she answered, like she hated giving me the words. That you represent structural inertia. That you're too entrenched in legacy processes to lead Sterling's evolution. I didn't respond. The burn was deep, but not unexpected. There's more, she added. It recommends a staged removal of your responsibilities, couched as a mutual agreement to part ways for strategic alignment. That phrase is repeated a few times, strategic alignment. I could hear the shame in her voice. He was laying the groundwork before anyone told me. I said, yes. Did you know? No. I believe you. Another pause, heavier now. What are you going to do, David? I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and said the truth. I don't know yet. But I'm not going to let them walk away clean. Later that evening, after the sun dipped below the skyline and the room turned to dusk, I stood in the corner of my office staring at the framed photo on the wall. Me and my father on the trading floor, 15 years ago. We were smiling. My hand rested on his shoulder like a student grateful for the lesson. Now, all I saw in that photo was a man grooming a replacement he never intended to keep. I had been a placeholder, a safety net, a shield. Someone steady to manage the old while he fell in love with the new. I picked up my phone and opened the old contact I hadn't used since her exit from the firm 5 years ago. Morgan Chun, former general counsel, sharpest legal mind I've ever known. Left Sterling after a quiet conflict with my father over IP disclosures during the merger with Haverly. She knew where the pressure points were. I dialed. She picked up on the second ring. David, she said, no surprise in her voice. I wondered how long it would take. I need your help. You got cut out? Yes. And Noah's at the center of it. Yes. And you finally believe what I told you 5 years ago. I do. There was a pause. Then the sound of a chair creaking as she leaned back. Then let's begin. Morgan didn't waste time with sympathy or ceremony. She asked for everything. Emails, filings, screenshots, timestamps. Anything that could demonstrate how Noah's rise had been orchestrated, not earned. I sent her everything I had, and by the following afternoon, she responded with a direct question that landed heavier than anything I'd heard since the day my father disinherited me. Are you willing to use the trust agreement? I stared at the message longer than I needed to, because I knew what she meant and I had avoided thinking about it since the beginning. The original Sterling Holdings Trust, signed 27 years ago and revised 3 times, had a buried clause that had always been theoretical, something our old attorney once referred to as a failsafe for bloodline protection. It stated that any redistribution of core assets, including executive control, required consent from all primary beneficiaries if the action could materially impact the value of their shares. That clause had been ignored. My father had executed the changes unilaterally, assuming silence would translate to acceptance. He had not counted on me fighting it. Morgan was reminding me that I still had standing, and she was asking if I was ready to press it. I didn't answer immediately. I sat with it through the night, through Lisa's quiet glances from across the kitchen table, through the silence that always came after loss, the kind of silence that doesn't make sound but settles into your chest. I called Morgan the next morning. Use it, I said. All of it. Her voice didn't change, but I could tell she had been waiting to hear those words. We'll need to be surgical. No drama. No public statements. No open threats. We file a motion to freeze the internal restructuring, not in court, but directly with the trust's arbitration panel. They're required to review challenges in less than 30 days. In the meantime, you say nothing. I agreed without hesitation. It wasn't just because I trusted her judgment. It was because I understood something my father and cousin had forgotten. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet and procedural. Sometimes it's just one signature filed in the right office at the right hour that freezes millions in place. Over the next week, Morgan assembled the package. She looped in 2 attorneys from a boutique firm in Boston, people I had never met, but who knew trust law like they'd written it themselves. They crafted the filing like it was a corporate audit, emotionless and precise. It wasn't an accusation. It was a query. Did the recent transfer of voting power from a primary beneficiary to a non-voting party violate Article 7, Section B of the Sterling Holdings Trust? Was there material risk to David's position in the firm's long-term capital structure? And had he been afforded the opportunity to consent or object? Once the filing was submitted, the silence became everything. No one at Sterling knew yet. The arbitration panel operated quietly, confidentially. No one had to be notified until the review board approved a formal injunction, and until then, Noah and my father would continue building their illusion. I didn't interrupt them. I let them dig in. I let them settle into their false comfort. I let them keep believing I had walked away. In the background, I began assembling my own leverage, not to destroy Sterling, not even to damage it, but to remind them of what they'd discarded. I reached out to 3 institutional clients I had worked with for over a decade. These weren't just contracts. They were relationships I had built from nothing, men and women who had trusted me with generational wealth. I didn't tell them I'd been cut out. I didn't speak badly about the firm. I simply told them I was exploring new ventures and wanted their guidance on what mattered to them in a partner now. Every call ended the same way. Tell me when you're ready, David. We'll follow you wherever you go. Lisa sat across from me at dinner one evening. Her fork paused over her plate. You're doing something, she said, but you're not telling me what it is. I looked at her, wondering how much she wanted to know. I'm reclaiming what I built, I said, quietly. She didn't press. She didn't offer a speech about ethics or vengeance. She just nodded once and went back to her food, the kind of understanding that comes from 20 years of watching someone lose pieces of themselves and finally decide to stop bleeding. The arbitration board approved the preliminary injunction 16 days after the filing. A formal notice was sent to Sterling's general counsel, freezing any further transfer of trust control and ordering a temporary hold on internal restructuring plans tied to executive succession. The reaction came within 3 hours. My father called twice. I didn't answer. Then came the email. One sentence. No greeting, no sign-off. You're making a mistake you won't recover from. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Morgan without comment. 5 minutes later, she replied, "Let him sweat. He'll reach out again." She was right. The next day, I received a call from the firm's lead trustee, an older man named Ashford who had always treated me like a second son. He didn't ask why I'd filed the challenge. He didn't even sound surprised. "They never thought you'd do it," he said. "They thought you'd disappear." "I was never going to disappear," I said. "I just waited until I had something sharp enough to cut through." Ashford paused, then said something I didn't expect. "We never stopped respecting you. Some of us saw it coming. We just didn't know you'd be the one to move first." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. "They're calling an emergency board meeting next week," he added. "Your father wants to contain this quietly. Noah is pushing for arbitration to be withdrawn and handled privately." "Of course he is," I said, "because exposure is fatal." Ashford didn't confirm or deny. He just sighed. "I hope you know what you're doing, David." "I do," I said, "for the first time in a long time." By the end of the month, the arbitration board would hold a closed-door session. And for the first time since I was disinherited, I wouldn't be walking into that room alone. Morgan would be beside me. The filing would be in our hands. And the legacy they tried to bury would be standing directly in front of them. The boardroom looked exactly the same, but everything inside it had changed. The dark walnut table still ran the length of the room, polished to a shine so reflective you could see your own doubt staring back at you. The framed prints of global market indices still lined the walls like trophies. The chairs were still arranged with surgical precision, every seat at equal distance from the next, as if symmetry could make power feel fair. But this time, I wasn't sitting at the edge of the table as an heir waiting to be acknowledged. I was seated at the center, across from my father, while Morgan reviewed the arbitration documents beside me like she was preparing for surgery. Noah wasn't in the room. That was the first surprise. Instead, he sent in a corporate attorney with an expression that said she didn't know whose mess she was trying to clean up. I didn't bother asking where he was. I already knew. He had never been built for confrontation. He moved in whispers, through other people's hands. Today he was letting someone else absorb the discomfort he couldn't handle. Ashford, the lead trustee, opened the meeting with a practiced neutrality. His voice was measured, calm, the voice of a man who'd spent decades pretending emotion was something you left at the door with your coat. "We're here to determine whether recent leadership shifts violate the terms of the Sterling Holdings Trust as outlined in the 1996, 2002, and 2015 amendments. Specifically, whether beneficiary rights were ignored during the execution of those shifts, and whether control was transferred in a way that threatens the integrity of the trust itself." My father gave a slight nod, hands folded. He hadn't looked at me once. Not during the opening remarks, not when Morgan entered, not even when the arbitration order was read aloud. I sat still, expression blank, waiting for him to acknowledge that I wasn't a ghost. Morgan was the first to speak, not with anger, not with accusation, but with evidence. She walked the trustees through a timeline of internal decisions, board memos, appointment records, strategic transfers of voting rights from trust-held shares into Sterling Horizon LLC, all executed without my consent. She spoke with clinical precision, her tone sharp but never theatrical. When she finished, she slid a single folder toward the trustees, and I could feel the shift in the room. It was the folder Noah had buried, his initial memo to my father, arguing for my removal and justifying it with inflated projections and buzzwords that collapsed under scrutiny. The document stated plainly that I lacked digital adaptability, that I had resisted transformation, and most damningly, that the risk of legal resistance is minimal given his temperament. Morgan let that sit for a moment, then turned toward my father. "That line wasn't just presumptive," she said. "It was incorrect." He still didn't look at me. Ashford glanced between us, then gave my father the floor. "I acted within my rights as majority trustee," he said, calm and sure, the same voice I'd grown up with, the voice that never changed, no matter who he was disappointing. The decisions were strategic. This was not a removal. It was a transition. David was compensated. No financial harm was done. No language in the trust was violated. I leaned forward for the first time since the meeting started. I was not compensated, I said, keeping my voice even. I was offered a severance package. You stripped me of voting shares. You removed my executive role. And you did it in the exact window when the Talon acquisition went through. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. It wasn't personal, he said softly. That broke something in me. I didn't raise my voice, didn't lean in farther, didn't let the anger rise to the surface. I just kept speaking because that was the only power I still believed in. It was deliberate, I said. You replaced your son with a narrative. You traded decades of experience for a pitch deck. And you made one critical mistake. You assumed I would accept it. Finally, he looked up. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between weariness and calculation. I couldn't tell if he was preparing to strike or already regretting everything. Ashford raised a hand before either of us could say more. There's more, he said. Before we issue a decision, we've received supplemental material from the Oversight Committee. Everyone turned toward the screen at the end of the room. Ashford nodded toward his assistant, who activated the display. What came up wasn't legal text or market reports. It was a series of emails, internal messages between Noah and an outside consultant. The consultant worked for a venture firm in Singapore. The emails confirmed that Noah had already begun leveraging Sterling Horizon's projected capital base to secure third-party investments. Not hypothetical projections. Actual fundraising efforts based on assets still tied to the Sterling Holdings Trust. There was a paper trail. Timelines. Proof that trust assets had been exploited for personal positioning. Morgan didn't need to speak. The emails spoke for themselves. I didn't smile. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Ashford turned toward the table, his voice flat. We will recess for private deliberation. A ruling will be issued within 72 hours. In the meantime, all leadership restructuring within Sterling Global is officially suspended. The room emptied slowly. No one made eye contact. My father left last. He paused by the door, still not looking at me. You think this wins you something, he said low. No, I replied. But it reminds you that I was never disposable. He hesitated, then walked out without another word. Morgan stood beside me, arms crossed. That went better than I expected, she said. It wasn't enough, I said. Then we keep going. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because something had shifted. The silence I had endured since that first morning was gone. The mask had cracked. The plan was no longer in their hands. And for the first time in my life, the legacy I was born into no longer belonged to them alone. The ruling came 46 hours later. A 2-page summary delivered via certified mail and encrypted email. The arbitration panel had determined, unanimously, that the leadership transition executed by the acting trustees violated the consent clause outlined in the 2015 amendment to the Sterling Holdings Trust. Effective immediately, all attempted asset and voting transfers initiated under Sterling Horizon were nullified. My stake was to be reinstated. My rights as a primary beneficiary restored. The trust had spoken, but the legal restoration wasn't what mattered most. It was what happened next. What always happens when a mask falls and the room finally sees the face behind it. The same morning the ruling was released, 2 managing partners from Sterling's London desk submitted their resignations. One of them forwarded me a private message. We've read the filings. We were never told the full story. If you're building something else, let us know. Within hours, the Tokyo branch placed a formal request for clarification on the firm's governance structure, citing internal leadership contradictions. Noah's carefully planted illusions had started to unravel faster than he could patch them. I didn't have to say a word. The filing had done the talking. And now silence was no longer on his side. At 5:42 p.m., I received a message from him directly for the first time since my removal. It was short. Only a sentence. Let's talk before this becomes irreversible. I stared at it for a long time before replying. It already is. The next morning, Morgan and I met with the trust's legal liaison in Ashford, not in the boardroom this time, but in a smaller private conference office reserved for transition events. The irony didn't escape any of us. This space had always been used for handovers, for when a family member retired or died or quietly stepped back to allow a new generation to take the wheel. Today, I wasn't being handed anything. I was there to decide what to take and what to leave behind. Ashford gave a neutral update on the trust's posture. You're entitled to reinstate your executive seat, he said. You can contest Noah's recent title or move to dissolve Sterling Horizon if you can prove asset misuse. Morgan looked at me, but didn't speak. We had discussed this already. I knew exactly what was on the table, but I had also spent the past week remembering who I was before the company, before the fight. And somewhere between the betrayal and the strategy, I'd realized something unexpected. I didn't want it anymore. Not like this. Not surrounded by ghosts of rooms where I'd once sat trying to prove I was worth a place at my father's table. So I shook my head. I don't want the seat, I said. I don't want his office or the structure he built. I want my stake reinstated, full oversight into Sterling Horizon's activities for audit purposes, and I want out of day-to-day operations. Effective immediately. Ashford didn't react. He simply noted it and moved to the next item. Morgan looked at me after the meeting, once we were alone. You could have taken the whole thing, she said. Burned it to the foundation. I know. You chose not to. It wasn't mine anymore. She nodded, not with disappointment, but something closer to understanding. You're starting something else. I didn't confirm it. I didn't have to. She'd seen the way I'd been moving, the meetings I'd taken, the people I'd called, not to make threats, but to ask real questions. What would they invest in now? What did they stop trusting? What kind of leadership did they still believe in? It wasn't vengeance I wanted. It was clarity. I wanted to build something that didn't begin with my father's name on the door and end with someone else pulling the strings behind it. That night, Lisa poured us 2 drinks and sat beside me on the couch. She waited until the quiet had settled, then asked the one question I hadn't prepared for. Do you feel like you won? I took a long breath, let the glass rest against my palm before answering. No, I said. I feel like I stopped losing. She nodded slowly, not satisfied, but not surprised. 20 years of watching me climb a ladder someone else had built, only to realize the top wasn't where I wanted to be. I got a call from Amelia, she said, referring to our daughter. She heard something through friends in finance. She said, Dad's the heir again. That sat in the air between us for a while. She's not wrong, I said, but that word doesn't mean what it used to. A week later, I submitted the paperwork to form a new firm, smaller, flatter, designed around collaborative investment in long-term infrastructure and technology, not speculation and fast exits. I invited 5 former Sterling clients to a private roundtable. They all showed up. No one asked about my father. No one asked about Noah. They just asked what I was building and how they could be part of it. I still see my father sometimes. Industry events. Private circles. We nod across the room. But we don't speak. He hasn't reached out since the ruling. He didn't try to recover what he lost. I think he knew. Not just that he had miscalculated, but that he had destroyed something he could never build again. As for Noah, I read somewhere that he stepped back from Sterling Horizon for personal reasons. The venture still exists on paper. It raises small amounts from less discerning backers. But it doesn't carry weight. It's a shadow that no longer belongs to me. What belongs to me now is something quieter, something stronger. Not revenge, not a throne. Control, choice, legacy on my terms. And no one gets to take that from me again.